Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming out here this evening. It's a hot day outside, and I appreciate you guys braving the traffic and the weather to come out here for this event. So, a couple minutes, give a few seconds while everyone gets settled. All right, well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another great World Affairs Council of Greater Houston program. Tonight, we welcome back Joel Simon as he presents his new book, The Infodemic: How Censorship and Lies Made the World Sicker and Less Free, where he will be discussing how governments use COVID for means other than public health and awareness and protection. Before we continue, we do have a few announcements. Join us next Wednesday, the 15th, for a taste of Mongolia. To get a feel of the Mongolian culture, we will dine at Happy Lamb Mongolian Hot Pot and prepare our own hot pot meals. The cost is $45 per person and includes wine, beer, soft drinks, and desserts. We are also visiting 3 countries in Central Asia in September: Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan, part of a region also known as the Stands, which many of you have already made travels on already with us. Vast in area, the region is known for stunning mountains and nomadic horse riding culture. So if you fancy drinking fermented mare's milk and sleeping in a yurt, this place is for you. And lastly, we have our last call from Morocco. In October, we are visiting this friendly country to experience the sights and cultures, which is a blend of ethnic tradition and religion, reflecting the Berber, African, Arab, and Jewish influences. For more information for our travels, visit our website or email us at travel@wacchouston.org. Now for our upcoming general programs. On Thursday, June 30th, we're back here at the Amity Bank Tower with Mr. James Kirchick, where he will be discussing his new book, Secret City: The Hidden History of Gay Washington. On June 7th, we'll have Houston's own Dr. Peter Hotez as he discusses COVID's origin, outlook, and lessons for the next pandemic. Lastly, save the date for a premiere event on August 8th as we welcome former United States Secretary of Defense, Dr. Mark Esper. And now, on to our speaker for this evening. Joel Simon is a fellow at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia Journalism School, and formerly the executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Before joining CPJ, he worked as a journalist in Latin America and California. He is author of books including We Want to Negotiate: The Secret World of Hostages, Kidnapping, and Ransom, from Columbia Global Reports. He lives in Brooklyn, New York. And just so you know, Joel Simon's acclaimed new book, The Infodemic: How Censorship and Lies Made the World Sicker and Less Free, will be available at the back, and he will be signing it for those who would like it at the back. Joining him in conversation tonight will be the Council's Director of Programs and Director of the Global Affairs and U.S. Foreign Policy Institute, Mr. Ronan O'Malley. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Joel Simon.
Thank you very much, Jahan, and thank you all for coming this evening. I know summer is always a harder time to get people out. A lot of you leave Houston when you can, the heat. I don't blame you. Great to have you all here, and a really important event. Many of you may have come 4 years ago. We hosted Joel in another incredible book, if you want a fascinating book to read called, We Want to Negotiate, all about hostage taking, hostage negotiations, and even the hostage insurance policies industry that I had no idea about. It was a fascinating story. But Joel, just to turn to today, you've been an incredible journalist for your entire, basically most of your adult life. You worked as a journalist, and then for 15 plus years were the executive director of the Committee for the Protection of Journalists, which, as the name implies, is for the protection of freedom and free speech and media openness, and sadly, a lot of times for defending journalists who have been, either taken into prison, sometimes held hostage, or sadly following up for journalists who have been killed. But to return to what we're discussing now, the issue of censorship and free press is something you've covered for a long time. But can you talk about why you felt the real need to write this book in particular, and maybe just help people get a better understanding of what you mean by the term infodemic?
Sure. Well, first let me say, what a special place the World Affairs Council of Houston is. I've written a bunch of books, I've done a bunch of book tours, and this is a unique venue with a uniquely engaged and active and curious and informed audience. So it is a real pleasure to be here, and I'm so grateful to Ronan for inviting me back. So both of my last two books, We Want to Negotiate and this book, The Infodemic, came out of my experience as executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. So the last book, We Want to Negotiate, the reason I wrote that is when I was in my CPJ role, we saw all these journalists being kidnapped around the world, and we were struggling with, how should we respond? A number of them were killed, they were executed by the Islamic State, and there was a whole debate about what the U.S. should do. Should it engage with terrorists? Should it pay ransom? And I went out and reported that book and wrote that book because of my experience in the role as executive director of CPJ. And this book has a similar origin story, and let me tell you how it came about, which is that at the beginning of the pandemic, so in March 2020, when it first became apparent that there was this new virus spreading around the world, what we saw, the way governments reacted everywhere that the virus emerged, was not by leveling with the population and recognizing the critical threat to public health. It was by suppressing, covering up, denying, confusing, and undermining efforts to build a public health consensus. And the book sort of starts in China, in Wuhan. China, of course, is the most censored country in the world, and we are one of the most censored countries in the world, certainly. And the Chinese government responded to the outbreak of this new virus in Wuhan by suppressing information about it, by covering up the medical establishment, which was raising the alarm. And then as the virus spread to Iran, to Russia, to Egypt, to Latin America, and then through the democratic world, we saw country after country put doctors in jail who were informing the public about the threat, put journalists in jail. And what we saw was the kind of censorship that was employed. There were sort of two forms of censorship. One was kind of the traditional form, it was sort of authoritarian, repressive censorship, and the other was sometimes called censorship through noise. And that was when leaders, particularly in democratic countries, and I would argue in this country, that's part of the argument in the book, instead of suppressing information, they recognized that in the moment we live now, what really is in short supply is attention. And it could undermine public understanding just by confusing people and creating a narrative about the threat that was not really recognizing the public health implications. And that was the infodemic. It was a wave of both suppression of information and lies and misinformation that undermined public understanding. And we saw this response spread around the world along with the virus. And so we at the Committee to Protect Journalists observed a wave of censorship, of global censorship, that was frankly unprecedented, and that we felt undermined fundamental rights and even helped undermine the formation of a public health consensus, and that this had enormous implications for security, for democracy, and for public health.
Yeah, thank you. And it's a fascinating book. I love it when I learn a lot from a book myself. The nice thing is it's a short book designed to be read easily and quickly. It's not, sometimes you guys come here, we have an 800-page book, like, oh man, I'm gonna be up for a few weeks till 3 o'clock in the morning. But this is a great book, a lot of information in a relatively short package. And I appreciate the fact that you, as you mentioned, you take on equally the autocracies of China, of Russia, but also Iran, and also what we consider the democracies of Brazil and India, and even in the U.S. You equally are critical of Republicans like President Trump and Democrats like Mayor de Blasio in New York. Can you talk a little bit more about the idea of, you mentioned, censorship through noise, and this idea of not necessarily censorship, but creating misinformation or lack of the ability to get to the actual information by flooding people with so much information. A lot of it's false. And then related to that, the big concept, and you mentioned the debate in regards to social media, that it is crucial that we hopefully have social media companies that would address this information, but at the same time, especially autocratic authoritarian regimes, they love this idea because it gives them a way to restrict or shut down social media.
Yeah, I mean, look, these issues are incredibly complicated because the global system of information is kind of a jerry-rigged system. In other words, information does not respect borders. It's kind of like the virus itself. It's, censorship in one country, censorship in China impacts all of us because there's essential information that we need that's not available to us because the Chinese government is censoring what's happening there. And so information flows, need to flow across borders in order for there to be in order for us to address global challenges like a pandemic. And the system of global information basically failed this stress test. You could say the pandemic was a stress test, and it basically failed. I mentioned, that in places like China and Iran, I sort of profile one blogger in China. His name is Chen Qixi, and he was one of the first citizen journalists to sort of document the outbreak of COVID in Wuhan. He actually is a lawyer, and he got on a train and he went to Wuhan, and he just brought his camera and he just, kind of recorded these videos and uploaded them on YouTube. And of course, eventually the Chinese government caught up with him and they put him in jail. And that was like a more traditional form of censorship. But then I also talk about, just as an example, Brazil. Now, in Brazil, you had a president in Jair Bolsonaro, who was one of the great COVID deniers. Now, why would a president deny the public health threat of this virus? The reason was because Bolsonaro understood that the kind of measures that he would need to take to protect public health would have significant political costs and would have a significant impact on the Brazilian economy. And he did not want to basically pay that political cost. And one of the things about Bolsonaro was that he was a close political ally of President Trump. And I talked to I interviewed in the book the Minister of Health in Brazil, a guy named Luis Henrique Mandetta, who some people call the Dr. Fauci of Brazil. He led this kind of information insurgency within the government. He basically recognized that the president of Brazil was lying to the Brazilian public, and he started a kind of nightly press conference where he would provide accurate information as a way of countering the kind of lies and confusion that the president was selling. And one of the things that I talked about, the Minister of Health of Brazil told me, remember that meeting that President Trump had with the president of Brazil at Mar-a-Lago. It was March 8th. It was soon after the pandemic began, and they had a party and a conga line, and it was a big shindig, and basically everyone got COVID. It was a super spreader event, and like the whole Brazilian delegation came home and was infected. And what Mandetta told me is he thought that Trump and Mandetta had sort of coalesced around a similar strategy, which was number one, hype hydroxychloroquine as a miracle cure. So you saw this happening in Brazil, and you saw it happening in the United States. Number two, blame China. So there was this very, and China certainly has a significant amount of responsibility, but at a certain point, it was about protecting the public health of Brazilians and not about, blaming. But, this was a strategy that the president of Brazil used. And the third was delegate authority to the states and municipalities to take whatever action they may take, but also criticize and undermine them so that if it works and it's effective and it slows the spread of the disease, great. And if it doesn't, then you can blame them for whatever, unpopular measures are being taken. And this was the way that, populist democratic leaders sort of managed the crisis, was by sort of confusing, undermining, monopolizing attention, and shifting the narrative away from a kind of productive discussion about the necessary public health measures, and just undermining any efforts to have an informed discussion about the steps that might be necessary in the context of a global pandemic.
And maybe we'll just kind of cover a few countries.
Yeah.
You cover some in the book, Egypt or Nicaragua, which we just may not have time to get into. Very interesting stories as well. But China, obviously, despite their claims that it originated outside of China or that the U.S. military was involved, COVID starts there. But maybe even before COVID, because you've covered censorship around the world for a long time, can you talk about, you discuss it in the book, the idea of the authoritarian dilemma, that if you oppress information too much, it can harm your economy that needs to be integrated with the rest of the world. If you open it up too much, obviously you open yourself up to protest and dissent. And you talk about, hey, maybe China, sadly, has probably navigated that balance very well, and that the goal for China is not to really suppress or prevent information, but manage information.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of, sometimes it's called the dictator's dilemma, the authoritarian dilemma. I think China has kind of found its way out of it. So the premise is, if you are integrated into the global economic system, you need to have some level of information, because if you have transnational businesses that are operating in your country, or communities of migrants who are sending money home, or there are a whole range of reasons why it's almost impossible today to isolate yourself completely from and create like sovereign systems of information. On the other hand, if governments recognize, and they look at the recent examples going back to like the color revolutions or the Arab Spring, that if they lose control of the information sphere, then that's a threat to power. So what is the right equilibrium? How much information do you suppress, and how much information do you allow to circulate? Well, China has used its own technology to create an entire, alternative information structure. All of the, kind of social media apps that people use in China are basically Chinese companies that the Chinese government is able to access, and the Chinese government is able to manage and monitor communication. And one of the things that happened during the pandemic, not just in China, but certainly in China, under the guise of protecting public health, was this massive expansion of state surveillance. This is when the technology, the communication technology, is turned on its head and used to actually monitor communication and even movements. In China, it's mandatory that you download an app on your phone that is used to track your health status, and in order to access public venues, you need to be able to have a green pass on your phone. And this is an example of how COVID, the pandemic itself, was exploited to increase state surveillance, and we saw this in places like Russia as well. We even saw it in Singapore. We saw it in Israel, even in the democratic country. So what we saw is these communication technologies sort of work both ways. They can be used to facilitate communication, but they can also be used by governments to monitor the movement and activities of their populations. And of course, a public health emergency is the perfect pretext in which to expand these kinds of efforts.
And you touched upon social media. In the book, you note how all of the typical social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or versions of it, or the Western versions, mostly from the United States, are not allowed in China, but they're replicated in China, and a lot of times on a massive scale. So it would be WeChat or Weibo.
Right.
Can you talk about why they did that, and also some of the methods they use? You mentioned, I think it's one of the dissidents, Chen, that you mentioned. how that besides just shutting down their social media accounts, you're prevented from opening, for instance, a new TikTok account because every account requires facial recognition software, and they have facial recognition data on virtually every person in all of China.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing that people need to understand about the Chinese information system, I mean, I've never used Weibo or WeChat, but I've talked to, plenty of people who live in China and have used it, and they like it better. I mean, it's fully integrated in like US, social media platforms, because it's fully integrated. You can do everything on it. You can, chat, you can search, you can share information, you can share photos, you can send money. It's fully integrated and there's a very engaged and vibrant like online community, and people have access to all sorts of information and entertainment. But it's, of course, and the one thing about China is it's really the only country where it's really has its own information infrastructure. So almost everywhere else in the world, people use US platforms and technologies, but China is really sort of operating almost entirely. I mean, people use virtual private networks to get on things like Twitter and YouTube, which are officially banned, but there's a certain amount of tolerance. But functionally, everyone in China is on these Chinese social media apps. And they're monitored. They're, part of the condition of being able to operate in China. These are, companies with either, direct government control or significant government investment. And, you have to be, you have to, provide information to the Chinese authorities at any time. And they're monitored closely, and you have to, actually comply with their policies in terms of monitoring the online activity. And yes, a lot of these technologies have actually integrated facial recognition technologies. So if you have been banned from one application and you try and go on another one, you may find that, when you try to get on it and you have to, use a facial recognition to get on it, that it's going to recognize you and block you. And I talked, this dissident I mentioned earlier, Chen Qishi, was a blogger and journalist, and he sort of got to start covering the unrest in Hong Kong, and they had kicked him off all the Chinese social media platforms because of his activities there. And so when he went to Wuhan and was documenting the response of the authorities and the overrun hospitals and the kind of just the kind of the fact that the city was just simply overwhelmed and people were like waiting in line to access medical care, and there were bodies in the street and all the horror of the initial outbreak of COVID. Well, the government was able to recognize, I mean, not the government, the social applications recognized that he was blocked, and the only way he could get his information out was on US platforms like YouTube and Twitter. And eventually, as I mentioned, the government caught up with him. They arrested him. They arrested about 8 or 9 bloggers who engaged in this kind of activity. And that suppression of information about the initial outbreak of the disease probably slowed the response around the world. It meant that governments around the world had less information when the disease first emerged in their countries in terms of how to respond appropriately. And as I said, the wave of censorship and suppression of rights spread along with the virus as it jumped from country to country.
And then you mentioned Russia earlier. Soviet Union / Russia, sadly, a long history of misinformation by which our governments in power. We kind of had our hopeful decade of the 90s, perhaps, but a lot of that's changed. And also a history of it leading to serious impacts. The years of kind of misrepresenting the number of deaths or the intensity of the Afghan war was not the only factor, but a factor in the collapse of the Soviet Union, along with, say, Chernobyl, the lies the Soviet government told people at first, another way of the people just be kind of disillusioned with their government. Can you talk about how Russia today, in the last few years, responded to COVID, and I suppose try and promote their own vaccine that a lot of people are hesitant about because they don't trust the government, and the Russian response?
Yeah, so Russia, it's interesting. So the initial response of President Putin to the outbreak of COVID, the initial outbreak of COVID in Russia, was to hide. He was terrified of the virus, and he went into seclusion. He's got this, he's got a number of giant mansions, but he's got this one that's about 2 hours, it's like just halfway between Moscow and St. Petersburg, and he just went into seclusion, and nobody saw him. And then he emerged at one point in like a hazmat suit to meet like a doctor who was like treating COVID patients, and shook hands, and then it turned out the doctor had COVID. So Putin was not exactly, like as we write in the book, leading the charge against COVID, bare-chested and on horseback. He was actually, that's a reference to the famous picture of Putin, which maybe
he's got a great calendar.
Yeah. So he was actually terrified of it, but it's, he did something very particular. I mean, every country had its own political culture. So when it served his purposes, he denied that this, like other countries that I mentioned, for example, Iran or Nicaragua, they just covered up and said, this is nothing, there's no disease here, nothing to see here, go on with your lives. And then in other instances, when it served his political purposes, he would sort of hype the threat. So to give an example, so a number of dissidents, including lawyers for Alexei Navalny and members of the sort of dissident punk rock protest band Pussy Riot, were actually held in home confinement for sanitary violations because they were allegedly exposed to COVID and they had to be confined in their homes. Or, when the protests were banned in Moscow, political protests, as a public health measure. But miraculously, when the Victory Day parade, was scheduled to take place in May, in advance of a referendum that would allow Putin to extend his term, the public health emergency was suddenly lifted, and it was fine to go into the streets and express your support for President Putin. So these were sort of examples of the kind of opportunistic response we saw in many countries around the world, where they denied the public health threat when it was convenient, and they exaggerated it when it provided a critical pretext for them to suppress rights that they thought were threatening to power. And the other thing that was interesting about Putin, and this is somewhat of a conjecture, but I talked to a number of Russian journalists who really thought that, one of them said, COVID was a gift to Putin. Because, first of all, in his own analysis, he was able to extend greater control over the population using these kinds of public health measures. He expands, I mentioned, banning protests, expanding surveillance. On the other hand, he perceived that the West, the democratic world, the US, Europe, was deeply divided and further polarized and ineffectual in its response to the pandemic. And, it's hard to know exactly what Putin was thinking, but was that a calculus in his decision that this was the right moment to go into Ukraine, in a sense that he had consolidated power domestically and, the sort of democratic world was divided and polarized? I think that's a reasonable supposition, and it's just a way in which the pandemic, without us really being aware and focused on it, has shifted global security, in ways that I think we're really just beginning to recognize and understand.
And maybe just turning to a last, kind of authoritarian regime before we turn to a few democratic examples and broader discussion. Iran, sadly, people might remember, was one of the countries first country to be very, very hardly hit. Thousands of deaths. We probably it'll be years, maybe we'd have to have a new regime before we probably ever got the truth about the number of people that died. But again, it was something used by the government to, like the Chinese, blame it on the West. Even the quote-unquote relative moderate President Rouhani said, this is an enemy's ploy, meaning the enemy meaning the West, the United States, to bring down the government. Can you talk about the Iranian response?
I think so. What's interesting, each, again, as I mentioned, each government responded differently. There were certain parallels, but the legitimacy of the Iranian revolutionary government is derived from its protection of religious expression. That is a critical function of the government, and so the government understood that it would be incredibly costly politically to block or prevent people from participating in religious pilgrimages. And so there were, a number of major religious festivals that, turned into, events that because people are moving around and they're staying in confined spaces and the virus had first emerged. And so the government just, if for Brazil or for the United States, the cost as it was perceived was, fundamentally economic. I mean, certainly that was a calculus for the Iranian regime as well. But it was really about, what they recognized would be very costly to prevent people from participating in religious observances. And what that did is it just, seeded the virus and allowed it to spread wildly throughout the country. And the only response the government could make in the face of this was to simply deny that the virus was this kind of threat to public health. So medical professionals, journalists, others who raised the alarm, who talked about what they were seeing in emergency rooms, that talked about the kind of toll that this was taking on public health, faced relentless persecution, where they were jailed, they were fired, they were vilified, and as Ronan just said, the toll in Iran is unknowable. This is true in many countries, by the way. They're just the WHO is just starting to kind of get data, that's looking mostly at excess deaths rather than actual reported deaths due to COVID. I mean, the toll of this disease is particularly in the developing world is probably much greater, magnitudes greater than we recognize. And again, this is a reflection of the global censorship and suppression of information that accompanied the disease wherever it spread.
And just for people to get a sense of what you're talking about, if the current estimates are, say, 3 million deaths globally or something like that from COVID, a lot of experts think it's possibly dramatically higher. And a lot of that's because, like you said, if we just look at excess deaths compared to the average of the last 5 years, that's a better measure than in so many places. The identification of the cause of death is another way to obscure the realities and lower the count. I mean, even Governor Cuomo in New York with nursing homes.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things we looked at, and this is another area that we explore in the book, is COVID was obviously a global pandemic, but it was experienced as a local story. So obviously the way people experienced it in Houston was different from the way we experienced it from New York, and it was different from the way people experienced it in Tehran or wherever their local community might be. And one of the things we looked at that was we believe was a fundamental reason that the disease governments were able to suppress information was the lack of local journalism in so many places. And we tell the story of, what local journalists could do about a newspaper in Tijuana, just across the border in Mexico, called Zeta. And, Mexico, like, local news is really suffered in Mexico. There's like a very few truly independent local news organizations, but Zeta is one of them. And the president of Mexico and his party were also big COVID deniers. They were just denying that it was a threat to public health. They refused to, shut down the economy and take reasonable measures to protect public health. The president, AMLO, would, go out and kiss babies and go to rallies and tell people not to worry. And the governor of Baja California, who was aligned with the president, employed a similar strategy. Well, the newspaper, Zeta, had contacts in the local hospital who were kind of sick. They took a picture of a bulletin board that showed all these deaths from atypical pneumonia. And so the newspaper was like, atypical pneumonia, that seems like a lot of deaths from atypical pneumonia. And they because they had these great contacts in the hospital, they were able to actually get information and make plain to the public that the government was covering up the extent to which COVID was affecting the local community. And, that compelled, the government to take some measures. And it's just an example of how critically important local journalism is, even when you're looking at like a global phenomenon like COVID-19.
And just to follow up, I think the book covers it very well. Can you talk about, obviously you have many years as a journalist, two things, maybe why it is local news is so important and why most communities trust local news more than, say, what they see on Fox News or CNN. So why that is important. And then also, local news was being decimated with the internet and, social media before COVID. But also the impact, I hadn't thought about until I read the book, of the massive advertising dollars and money that's generated from just Google and social media platforms that they make it impossible to compete with.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is that like the local media, certainly in the United States, but many parts of the world, was survived on local advertising, classified advertising, and all of that, migrated online. Craigslist in the United States and other kinds of online advertising, and it just basically the business model collapsed. And so in so many communities around the world, we don't have great data, but we have pretty good data in this country of just, they're called news deserts. So, either the newspaper has just been hollowed out, the local newspaper, or it doesn't exist anymore. And the thing about local news, the reason it's so important, and I look at this in the book, is people, there's this kind of notion sometimes, and I think it's a kind of arrogant, elitist notion, that people consume information as rational individuals. But people consume information as part of a community. And so it really matters, the community, their friends and neighbors, if they have a political identity, whatever it might be, their way of perceiving and understanding the world is also very much dependent on the community in which they're a part of. And local newspapers, what they tend to do is they tend to reinforce the reality that people observe in their own lives back to them. So maybe you live in a community, you observe an event, and then you read about it, or, in your local newspaper or online, whatever website, and you're like, that's exactly what I saw, that's what I experienced, it's reflected back to me. That's a kind of shared reality which is reinforced. Whereas, national news tends to be kind of abstract and far away and experienced not as a kind of local community, but based more on political identity. And so it tends to be, if you don't have that local news intermediating, it tends to be more polarizing and divisive. And the COVID pandemic was an experience, as I said, it was global. And because it was experienced as a local phenomena, and because in so many instances we didn't have, the kinds of decisions you have to make, like, is there high levels of COVID here, or is it prudent to wear a mask? Where can I get vaccinated? Are schools open? Those are all very, very local kinds of questions that you're not going to get the answer from watching CNN or Fox. But in so many places in this country and around the world, people really struggled to access that kind of information and build identification and communities based on shared understanding of local events.
And turning to the second largest country, the largest democracy in the world, India. Sadly, like Iran, the actual death toll is probably much, much higher than what has been reported. But somewhat similar to the kind of nationalist kind of strongman idea of a government you mentioned in Bolsonaro, Brazil. Besides the other elements of kind of obfuscation of numbers and whatnot, one of the things in the book that I guess caught my eye was, Prime Minister Modi, his strong kind of Hindu-centric government has been a concern for a lot of people. and kind of chastising Muslim communities, but even here amongst COVID started blaming Muslims and hit people in his party, Muslims, for spreading COVID within India. Can you discuss that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the response in India, India, again, I mentioned each country was unique. So India created its own narrative. And Modi's kind of persona was, he is a strong leader, a decisive leader. And Modi made a decision basically to shut down India. In a fairly early phase in the pandemic when the disease, was starting to spread. And this was an incredibly dramatic action. It was a very impulsive action. And of course, a lot of urban workers in the Indian cities, come to the villages, they couldn't have enough to eat. So, they had to figure out a way to get home to their village just to survive. And of course, there was this, out-migration from the cities back to villages, which was probably not exactly the right response. And people, it was so poorly organized that some people didn't have enough to eat, and there were stories that journalists reported of communities that couldn't access food, and Modi responded by, basically saying, "Oh, this is fake news and suppressiveness." But anyway, it came out of this lockdown with, there was this kind of narrative that emerged that, India had dodged a bullet and Modi's decisive action had saved the country from, from the kinds of worst effects of COVID. But then, when rates started to climb, and there was evidence that they were being hit with a really strong second wave, Modi, because it was contrary to his narrative that he'd already established, refused to recognize this and suppressed counter-narratives that suggested that COVID was spreading very dramatically, as a second wave. And it was horrific. I mean, it was a horrific outbreak. Just the stories you hear from talking to people in India about, just not being able to access oxygen for therapeutic treatment, and also the government's effort to suppress the number of deaths, because again, it was contrary to the narrative that Modi had established. And as a result, one of the things I looked at in the book is as a result of the kind of authoritarian measures that Modi took, the Freedom House, which is an organization that evaluates whether, they do an annual survey and they designate countries as either free or partly free or not free. And India, the world's largest democracy, had always been designated as free, but they downgraded it to partly free. 1.4 billion people, and now, a significantly greater percentage of the world today are living in an environment where they're less free than at the beginning of COVID, because so many countries, India included, have become more repressive and restrictive.
That's great. And just if any of you have questions, my colleagues are collecting these blue cards. And just maybe one more before we jump into the audience questions. We touched upon it earlier, kind of this newer, kind of more difficult version of authoritarianism to contend with. In the book, you discussed the idea of digital authoritarianism.
Yeah.
And then in terms of just technology and how it is used and or abused, could you talk about obviously for many reasons it didn't happen in the United States, but these contact tracing apps that were used everywhere from Israel to Singapore to Norway, which fought back against it, and there were kind of good results from it. But what these contact tracing apps were and why they were so concerning to people concerned about civil liberties.
Well, I mean, in a surprising way, the best example might be.
Maybe you could just briefly explain what they are.
Yeah. Okay.
How they work.
So in a number of countries around the world, I mentioned Russia, China, Singapore, Israel, many countries around the world. People were required to download a health app that was basically monitor your movements and monitor your whether you come in contact, for example, with somebody who might be positive with COVID, based on either Bluetooth, that's proximity to another device, or using GPS kinds of tracking. And, and the government sort of, said this was a necessary public health measure and would allow them to control the spread of the disease, and in some instances it's arguable, but it may have been a useful undertaking. But what it certainly did was gave governments vast troves of information about the movements of their citizens. And in a number, one example we look at, which was kind of surprising to us, was Israel. And basically, Israel, the government had actually been tracking, using this kind of technology, this kind of cell phone tracking to monitor the movements of the entire population. It already had this data. And it basically acknowledged, well, we have this data, so we're going to start using it to monitor, movements in relation to limit the spread of COVID. And people kind of shrugged. They basically said, well, if it helps keeps us safer, we're willing to go along with it. But they would use, one example we cite in the book is like using drones to, enforce surveillance. So they could tell, like from your phone, whether you were at home or whether you left your home, whether you were supposed to be quarantining. And sometimes they would actually send drones up to apartment buildings and say you have to come out on your balcony and wave to the drone so that you're actually at home. And this was it was my wife's family is from Canada. And in Canada, if you were tested positive from COVID, the government required that you download this app, and it would ensure that you were in your house and that you weren't leaving. In Russia, they have this app that was so intrusive. A number of Russian friends I spoke with told me would actually do push alerts sometimes in the middle of the night. It would wake you up and you would have to then take a selfie of yourself and send it to demonstrate that you were at home. And if you didn't do it quickly enough, like there'd be a knock on your door to make sure that you were observing quarantine. And if you left your house in Moscow, they deployed this, much more advanced and sophisticated facial recognition surveillance. So, if you were like, well, the hell with it, I'm just going to leave my house. You might get 3 blocks before, some facial recognition technology recognized you and the government was aware that you were no longer following quarantine.
And in the book, more dramatic ones in terms of punitive, you mentioned Qatar. If you didn't know on the up, I think you said you faced a $55,000 fine and possibly 3 years in prison.
Yes.
Yeah. So we're kind of lucky to be where we are in a lot of ways. Robert asked a good question. You discussed some of it in the book. And again, I highly recommend the book. You guys can get a lot more information than just what we can cover just in this one talk. But Robert asked, I remember that early on the WHO did not stress the role of China in COVID. Was the WHO covering up for China early on in COVID?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, covering up might be too strong, but certainly running interference. China exerts enormous influence over the WHO, and the WHO was, definitely afraid to confront China and was slow in declaring COVID a pandemic because they were under pressure from China. It's not totally clear exactly how that pressure was exercised, and of course China fought, resisted an independent international investigation of the origins of COVID and put a lot of pressure on the delegation that eventually went to Wuhan to investigate the origins and has maintained, contrary to all evidence, that it might have been brought to China via frozen food imported from Europe, or U.S. military exercises that allowed this bioweapon to escape. So there's a lot of misinformation and obfuscation that China has engaged in, and they definitely exerted pressure over the WHO, and the WHO did some things well. I don't think was certainly a challenging situation, but China has significant influence over the WHO and exercised it absolutely.
And it's almost hard to criticize the hand that feeds you. I mean, basically,
Right.
the United States and China are the two by far largest contributors to the WHO's budget.
Absolutely, and they were at odds. So
Yeah.
yes.
Someone asks, how does the censorship of online news sources, social network platforms, medical industry, and pretty much other outlets in the US and Europe in particular with regards to genuine questions regarding government policies or efficacy of lockdowns, mask mandates, and vaccines factor into the freedom of information and journalism that you've discussed? And maybe it's another question that's perhaps related to that. I'm a journalist here in Houston who faced social media censorship during the last 2 years. Does your book talk about censoring the rise of authoritarian practices from the perspective of reporting on COVID, vaccine, adverse reactions, etc.?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's a bunch of different strands there. So let me start with the first one. I think that as I mentioned, certainly the way that the pandemic played out in this country. I'm not a public health expert. I'm not an epidemiologist, so I'm not really weighing in on which was the most efficacious approach. But I think
Very quickly, I'll say, come July 7th,
yes,
we host Dr. Peter Hotez.
Right, there are many others who, I'm sure you'll hear from them, who have particular expertise in public health. I'm really looking at the kind of context in which this debate was happening. And, what, as I mentioned, the WHO, again, this has put out a handbook on how to respond to the emergence of a pandemic a couple of years before COVID-19. And one of the guidance they provided was, the most important assets that governments have in the outbreak of a new pandemic is communication. That's really all you have, right? You don't understand the origins of the virus. It's not necessarily clear what public health measures are necessary. And it's a moving target. Information is emerging in real time. There are things you don't know, things you think you know that you end up not knowing, and you have to convince people, well, we thought it was this, and now it's that, and we told you to do this, but that was wrong, and now we need to do that, right? And the only way you can convince people to follow this kind of guidance is if there's some element of trust, right? And so communication and trust, that's all you have. So too many governments around the world, and I would argue that the government in this country, really undermined that essential asset of trust by sort of sabotaging the public debate and attacking and vilifying, experts who certainly got things wrong. Let's acknowledge that, this was a confusing, difficult moment. But instead of sort of leveling with people and trying to guide a productive conversation about how understanding and science changes as we gain more data, there was a consistent effort to attack and politicize some of the public health interventions. And social media was a perfect tool for doing that because, as I said, we live in the attention economy. It's not it's information is abundant. Attention is really in short supply, and governments, and including President Trump, found ways to monopolize our attention and I think undermine an effective public debate. Now, the problem was that social media companies, I think, also came under enormous pressure on the other side, and they were under pressure to intervene and remove content that was deemed to be a threat to public health, and that was that was an exercise that they undertook that there may be justification of it, certainly in certain circumstances, but it was done without transparency and without accountability. And I think that further eroded kind of trust among communities that might have seen and experienced and understood events so differently. They felt that they were being censored, or or that they weren't being heard, or they were being marginalized, or they were being ridiculed. And so instead of forging a consensus, it deepened the divisions and again undermined a productive discussion that I think could have led to a greater public health consensus, and that played out in this country, but it played out in so many countries around the world.
Okay, and just for the sake of time, we'll do maybe 2 or 3 questions. Yeah. This one, you just touched upon some of it, but a lot of people ask similarly, have very similar concerns, and I'll just combine them all because I'd like to address as many audience questions as we can. But if you can just kind of comment on these collectively. Someone's asked, do you feel the U.S. censored its citizens and medical community to the detriment of trust? Someone else asked, can you comment on U.S. censorship and lies? Catherine asks, what perhaps unintended consequences were there from the changing messages of the CDC early on? And then similarly, someone asks regarding Fauci and Dr. Briggs, were they ignoring data to kind of maintain an atmosphere of alarm? I mean, I know they were roughly similar, but could you touch upon that?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think what all of these questions fit into the same framework which I just described, which is you need leadership that is acknowledging that information is changing, science is changing, understanding is changing, the response has to change. You get things wrong, and that the authority that government may need to invoke in order to protect public health, you have to build consent. It's still a political process, and you have to build support and consensus around that. And that was really the failure. I'm not really in a position to say, was the CDC, why did the CDC, I mean, there's plenty of reporting on this, and I do, why did the CDC guidance change? What mistakes did they make? They obviously made huge mistakes, for example, in the rollout of the testing and the guidance on mask wearing. But, for the most part, I think that, they were based on, perhaps incompetence rather than some sort of conspiracy. And I think that, a lot of again, this is not something I go into great detail in the book, but, the whole kind of alarmism, I experienced just personally, the first wave of COVID in New York City, which was a very different experience than, most places in the country. So I think, we understood what it was like to have hospitals overwhelmed and, mobile morgues outside, full of bodies. And all those measures were simply designed to protect the public health system and to ensure that it wasn't overwhelmed. And was there some kind of alarmism that may have contributed to those kinds of efforts? I think that's possible. But again, it's when I'm looking at these issues in a global context. But what I'm really trying to say is, the only instrument or the most effective instrument that governments have in the initial outbreak of a pandemic is communication and trust. Those are the tools that you need to use before you have a complete understanding of what the disease is, and you have to be able to convince people that advice changes, science changes, our understanding changes, and this is not some malevolent conspiracy. And I think certainly in this country and so many countries around the world, that ability was compromised and undermined by the activities of the political leadership, but also by the information environment in which we live.
Okay, and then just these 2 questions quickly. I know they're not necessarily easy ones to do quickly. Someone asked, just related to Russia, I'll just condense it. Do you believe that Putin deliberately, set up Europe with dependency on gas, and then, had that again convinced maybe even the Russian people that they wouldn't, be willing to stand up once they invaded Ukraine, and maybe just talk about the Russian media landscape since the war?
Yeah. Okay. Well, absolutely. Putin made a whole bunch of calculations about how the West would respond to the invasion of Ukraine. And certainly he felt that, Europe's dependence on gas, cheap Russian gas, and their link to, the links to the ties to Russia, that dependency would thwart any sort of resistance to the Ukraine invasion. I mean, it's obvious that was a miscalculation, but I think that factored in. But look, I mean, one of the things, like when I was at the Committee to Protect Journalists, I would go to Russia every year to meet with officials and advocate for the rights of journalists. And what I saw, I started going in 2008 after the murder of a very prominent journalist, Anna Politkovskaya, and we would, go to newsrooms and go to Novaya Gazeta, and we'd go to Echo Moskvy, which is like the leading independent radio station, and we'd meet with independent journalists, and then we'd go to the government and we'd say, the space is closing and there was a journalist killed, and why are you investigating? And each year, the space got more and more. The journalists who we could meet with, that group got smaller and smaller until it got to the point where our presence became a liability to them. Like, we stopped going because they were like, listen, we really appreciate all your help, but, if a bunch of Americans come and say, journalists are under threat in Russia, that's actually not helping us right now. It's actually giving the government, pretext to make things worse. So we said, okay, we're here to support you, not make your lives more difficult. Now, all those journalists, every one of those journalists we defended and fought for when I was at the Committee to Protect Journalists, they're either not working, including Dmitry Muratov, the editor-in-chief of Novaya Gazeta, who won the Nobel Prize recently, along with Maria Gazeta. He closed down his independent newspaper, or they're in exile. So, Putin has completely decimated, destroyed, the limited information space in Russia in response to the invasion. And I do think the lead up to this, just in bringing back to some of the themes in the book, came during that, the year and a half period when Putin consolidated power and control domestic, expanded his domestic authority, under the guise of COVID. I think there's a relationship.
And I would just say, I know some of you were here about 10 days before Putin invaded Ukraine. Some of you might remember we hosted, he was a Russian journalist, started as a journalist, Russian dissident and opposition figure Vladimir Kara-Murza, sadly an excellent example. When he finished here in Houston, 2 or 3 weeks later, he went back to Moscow and was arrested basically for speaking the truth about the war. And he's in prison now, and sadly it could be a long time before he gets out. So maybe just your thoughts, or any of you want to think about him, or kind of bring it home. Some of these incredibly courageous journalists around the world. But maybe it's a good way to wrap it all up. And maybe if there's anything else you wanted people to think about in regards to the topic and the book. Beth asked an interesting question. Is it possible that the use of the term infodemic as a metaphor, while journalistically powerful, contributes to state overreach and policy making?
That's a good. I like that's a good question. Well, I mean, I'm certainly, I'm going to have to disagree because that's the title of my book. But it is a good provocative question. I mean, the infodemic. What I'm trying to communicate, and what I think, the point I made earlier was this global system of information. It's so critical to our ability to live lives that are informed by information, to hold our leaders accountable, to participate in democratic government, to engage with civic institutions, to solve global problems. We need information. And I think that the information system at the local level, at the national level, and at the global level, again, was stress tested by this pandemic, and it failed. It failed because it did not allow us to kind of come together as individual communities, as a country, frankly, or as a global community to address this unprecedented threat to public health. And it failed because it was undermined through censorship, the kind of brutal censorship that I described, but also by this new form of censorship through noise, by distracting us, by undermining experts, by by polarizing communities instead of forging consensus. That is the infodemic. That is the infodemic, and the infodemic has, hopefully the pandemic will recede at some point. It feels like, we're getting to that point, but the infodemic is still with us. And I think we have to fight, censorship in all its forms. That's kind of the message of the book. We really can't, solve any of our problems, as I said, as communities or as a country or as a global community, unless we have information. And there are powerful forces that are undermining our ability to access the independent information that we need, and that, unfortunately, may well be a legacy of the pandemic.
And again, we're selling Joel's excellent book, and I will mention we're selling it at a dramatic discount we have a nice nonprofit price for you all, a lot cheaper, which you'll get on Amazon. Joel will also hang around to sign some of those books, or if you want to buy a digital version, of course. But again, the book is The Infodemic, How Censorship and Lies Made the World Sicker and Less Free. I want to thank you all for coming, and thank you so much to Joel Simon for an excellent event.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.